a lot of people who are asking this question, why can't we have our own API, OpenAI? To be fair to them, I think they're asking this not from a commercial perspective, but from a national security perspective. One is the question of the country, do we have enough talented and skilled people in deep tech sector like AI? But I think there's a implicit question there. Can you bring it all of them together, or at least a good chunk of them together in an entity like OpenAI? Just because we have a large economy, the best people will come and work and live and build companies here. No, they won't. They will go wherever it is the easiest to do business.
We're in the midst of an AI supercycle with companies in the US investing hundreds of billions of dollars in AI and governments treating it as a national priority. Yet, sitting in India, it feels like companies here are destined to remain small players on the global stage, at least at the AI platform level. And it was in this context that we came across an article titled, "Why Can't India Have Its Own OpenAI?" which dug into talent, GTM, capital, and ecosystem challenges that affect Indian companies. This was written by Joydeep Sen Sarma, founder of Clearfeed now, and previously founder of Qubole, a big data company that peaked at $50 million in ARR, but lost to giants like Snowflake and Databricks, which are now worth over $100 billion. Suffice to say, Joydeep knows a thing or two about this topic. So, Joydeep, welcome to Weekend Entrepreneurs.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to join, and thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, Joydeep, we thought we'd break down this conversation into 4 bits: talent, capital, GTM, and structural/government reasons. So, starting with talent, I wanted to pick on a portion of your article which said that at this stage of a super cycle, gifted technical founders or small groups of 10x engineers alone isn't sufficient, and that you need a large team of equally talented individuals, which I think you insinuated India didn't have an abundance of, at least when Qubole was at its heyday. So I guess my question to you is this still the case, or do you feel like this has changed a bit more as Indians return, having worked globally, and US companies have set their offices up here? And,
I think it is. Let's unparcel that a little bit. I think one is the question of the country, do we have enough talented and skilled people in deep tech sector like AI? But I think there's a implicit question there. Can you bring it all of them together, or at least a good chunk of them together in an entity like OpenAI? And I think we have a bit of a challenge with both. A lot of people compare us to China, so I think, we'll just sort of keep that in the background as well. So first of all, we are an open country. So people can emigrate, they can go work for MNCs. Unlike China, we don't have these walls, and also we are much earlier in our development journey as a country. So the motivation for a lot of people to move out is very high, and that is something that is very obvious, and you can observe on social media, a lot of complaints about infrastructure and whatnot. So I think looking back from the Qubole days, it's definitely true that the talent density in India has gone up a lot. Nowadays there are huge MNCs here with large GCCs, and there are a lot of talented people who are working in those companies. But that actually is the second part of the problem, as I mentioned, that if you try to build purely from India a sort of OpenAI kind of a vehicle, you will have to compete for whatever talent there is with every MNC in the world. The best talent, either they want to go abroad, or even if they don't, they will look at you versus joining a Microsoft or a Amazon or a Google, or maybe 3-4 other sort of large companies and so on, right? And it would not be surprising if OpenAI itself opened the office in India, at some point, right? I think they will certainly do that at some point. And so the question then for an Indian startup, and I think we need to discuss what that even means, because capital is global and everybody is sort of lurking globally, right? So, but anyway, let's assume that there is some notion of an Indian startup. It has to compete for that talent for the best talent with every company on the world. That is the reality, right? And at that point, it becomes economics, right? I mean, can you pay? And people, do get motivated outside of money. So money is not the only thing, and that is not the implication here. But certainly, if you want to scale out and hire lots of people in that caliber, money will become very important, and you will have to fight it out with the largest companies in the world with the deepest pockets.
Got it. So we'll come to capital in a bit, but let's say economics wasn't a problem for a second. Do you think, imagine that a startup in India could pay those OpenAI salaries, could compete financially. Do you think just in terms of sheer volume, that talent exists? That talent has
Absolutely,
enough incentive?
absolutely, right. So if you closed off our borders, right, or at least dampened immigration in a significant way, and you also did not have as much competition for the best talent from every top MNC in the world, that talent does exist, right? I mean, many people know this, and I pointed this out. The Transformers paper was written by some of the folks from India. There are a lot of Indians in top tier sort of like ranks in Google and now OpenAI. My ex-colleague from Facebook is the VP of engineering at OpenAI. A lot of my colleagues from Facebook have joined OpenAI actually. And so the talent exists, but it is not a standalone game. It's adversarial sort of a game, right, where you have to compete with other companies.
So then if you can just sort of skip ahead to capital, right? I mean, you mentioned even in your article that you had a relative lack of capital compared to the Snowflakes and the Databricks of the world who simply raised a lot more. Why, in a hypothetical world, why couldn't you have raised, if this was 2025, would you still see this as a major disadvantage? I know India has a VC ecosystem and it's maybe more nascent and people think a certain way, but even with funds globally free to invest across borders now, do you think it's still a problem in 2025 or is it just a matter of ambition, scale, volume?
So I think we have to distinguish the company I sort of founded and worked for versus sort of a more generic question. So I think Qubole, by the way, was not exact. I mean, I think I asked this in the previous question. What do we even mean by Indian company? Yes, it had a lot of Indian sort of founder DNA and even investor DNA, but it was headquartered in the Valley and did raise from some of the largest companies in the Valley. So I think. My broader point there was to point out that the economics of it have to work one way or the other, right? You have to raise lots of money, and raising lots of money cannot just be like a wish. People only give you money if you are like producing lots of revenues, right? So your economic engine has to really fire, right? Which is it has to produce high growth at high revenue for you to be able to raise a lot of money. And you can do one or two rounds. You can sort of like get by and sort of like you don't need to have the entire story come together. But if you're going to raise like hundreds of millions of dollars, then the whole story has to come together. Now, let's separate the two questions of what happened to us versus the challenges that somebody from here might face. I think what happened to us is a very complicated story, so I will not be able to explain it in this call. So I think clearly our economic engine was not as powerful as Snowflake's or Databricks' economic engine. And there are many reasons for that. There are some takeaways from there that I can pass on, but we simply could not establish as powerful sort of a economic cycle as our primary competitors. Now, one of the lessons there is that distribution is very important, as all repeat entrepreneurs sort of know from their heart. And our whole branding and distribution were not as strong as our competitors. I mean, that's just one of the aspects. There are many other aspects, but that's definitely one of the most important aspects. Now, so let's keep Qubole on the side for a minute. It had its own sort of set of problems. It was in the US now, but let's come to India. I'll just tell you, what I see. I think, as I tried to emphasize in that article, to establish an economic cycle like that, you cannot really think of a company as an Indian company, because your primary markets for establishing something very large have to be the West. If you're going to build somebody for millions of dollars, you need to be present there. Now, maybe you don't want to build somebody millions of dollars, and maybe you want to do something different, and that changes the discussion. But if you're kind of going to be an OpenAI kind of construct or a Databricks kind of construct, and have people who regularly pay you 100K and sort of in many cases pay you tens of millions of dollars, then you need to be very, very strongly focused and present in those markets. And it is very hard to quantify why exactly. It just sort of comes up for all kinds of reasons. You have an important client you have to meet, you have to be present on the ground, be present as a thought leader, as a founder, as a technologist, make yourself known to the ecosystem at large. A lot of this is relationship selling, right? I mean, people run into people at conferences and sort of they attend a talk and they say, okay, well, I'm going to go through a modernization project. You guys are in it. Let's sit together. It's a very high value sales means high engagement sales, right? So it's only very hard to quantify that you need to be there for X or Y reason, right? So I think at that point, the notion of an Indian startup sort of loses meaning. I mean, what does it even mean? It anyway doesn't mean. It's very difficult to define, right? Because capital is global, so you could be present here and still taking capital from like a pension fund in Canada or US. So what does it even mean to be an Indian startup? But let's park that aside. Like still, if you are in India, can you really be in India for that kind of a play? I would question that. Yeah. So now let's shift to let's say you were predominantly sort of founding Indian DNA and wanted, and we're doing well. So let's cross out the other factors that you were actually able to um, sort of have a good economic engine, right? So I think, yeah, the capital scene in India seems to be pretty reasonable. There's obviously a good amount of capital, but again, I think is it even relevant? Because from my perspective, capital is now a global sort of a phenomenon. The notion of a local capital is interesting to some extent because particularly if you're incorporated in India, I think it limits the vehicles from which you can raise money. But by and large, capital is a global phenomenon. So, and that was true even back then, honestly, right? I mean, for example, at Qubole, our um, some of our biggest investors were investors like Lightspeed, and we were invested out of their global sort of the US fund. But they had a nice team in India, and we used to chat with them as well. So if you were doing well in India as a company, like there are like lots of investors both in India and outside. I think Indian capital is more relevant for like local plays, right? I mean, if you want to do one of those, logistics, distribution, fast commerce, D2C, you name it, right? Yes, I think in those cases, I think you would get a lot more interest from a local venture capitalist who understands the local market. But if you're building a global SaaS play, and Rohit can chime in. I think he has had as much experience, or perhaps even more, at direct fundraising than I have. Is it even a relevant question? Right? It may be a little bit to some extent that you have relationships that matter in VCs also, so you can get closer to local VCs and so on. But I'm not very gung ho on this whole sort of like the importance of local capital.
Mm. I have a follow-up question over there. Do you feel like the horizon with which, let's say, Valley-based VCs operate versus VCs in India operate, to me at least, that feels very different. OpenAI for like 7-8 years, they were just working pretty much in obscurity, right? And they were just training their models. There was GPT-1, there was GPT-2, etc., etc. For some of those kinds of companies, do you feel like you need more patient capital?
Yeah, that is not possible with the capital that's available. Period. There is, but who can fault them, right? I mean, they've not seen a success story, and they don't have an experience of building companies like that. That actually, there is something very interesting about the point you raised. That is changing, though. I'll point out some examples. So, Snowflake is actually quite interesting because as a lot of people know, they raised money from Sutter Hill, and they have a very patient capital model. To echo Rohit's point, there's no market traction, nothing. You just sort of invest in some founders, and you actually try to build for the first few years a very deep product. That means for 2-3 years, you are sitting in a deep dark room. Nobody knows about you. You have very few customers at all. You might have some design partners, and it's a very very effective way of building high impact companies. But you need a lot of capital for that, and I am not in any ways as knowledgeable about the entirety of the Indian VC market to make a comment that it can or cannot happen. But yes, I think it is relatively rare, if at all. I think what I see, I mean, to be honest, is if what works in the Indian ecosystem is the FOMO thing, right? I mean, if one person is investing, 5 other people want to invest, right? And again, no fault, look, that's very natural, right? That happens to all of us. So I think if you can set off that FOMO race and sort of, get some people to get excited about your story and sort of write a large check, probably, 5 more people will come up, and, you might be able to do a good round without. And I will not take names. I have seen some large funding being raised by people without sort of much, honestly, like kind of like the Snowflake thing, right? They don't really have anything, right? And they are raising money based on their name and reputation. So that's great, actually, right? I mean, you take out the morality and the success rate and all the kind of things, but the fact that a credible founder, a second time, third time founder with like sort of $100 million exit is able to raise like a large check without sort of having anything more than some slides and some sort of ideas is happening now, right? And it's definitely happening a lot more because clearly, like anybody who's willing to write that kind of check for a slide deck is sort of going to look for like somebody who's kind of been there, done that before. And we have a lot more been there, done that now than we had like 10 years back, right? All the people who came out of the e-commerce boom or whatever, right? There's obviously been a lot of SaaS success stories as well and so on, right? So yeah, so I think we are much better placed now than then. But yes, I think the size of the check is still a relevant question. I mean, yeah, maybe we are getting to the point where $15-20 million written for something which is just a slide deck is probably feasible, but maybe not $100 million. We're not there yet.
Got it. Makes sense. Let's shift gears and talk about GTM. So on the GTM side, what I sort of noticed is there are certain GTM motions that work quite well for companies based out of here and selling globally. Primarily a content-driven inside sales model is essentially what, I don't even want to say pioneer, but Zoho, Freshdesk, in a lot of ways, even what several companies I know actually end up doing is that. And I would you say that's the case with like Clearfeed as well?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, honestly, like, I mean, my lesson was, do something. I mean, if you're going to be based out of this geography, which I sort of am at this point, you should do something that is consistent with this geography, right? Because one of my sort of core learnings from building a company was the whole company has to be aligned. From sort of GTM to the engineering team to product vision, founder market fit, and team, like everything has to be aligned, right? So I think very, very strongly echo what Rohit has just mentioned, that if you want to do remotely, you have to work with sort of digital marketing and stuff like that, right? And that's your, at least to get started. Now I think later on, you can do other things. I think let's see. I think I mean, actually, even if you take the Freshworks and Zoho example, now they do have large North America GTM teams. So you can certainly layer on, more expensive GTM motion once you have sort of gotten started. That seems very feasible. I personally like that approach because it seems lower risk. I think doing expensive GTM to begin with is higher risk. It's as simple as that. I think higher risk for everybody. It is particularly high risk if you are, I think, from here. Because if you don't have roots in that area and sort of you're trying to transplant yourself and trying to land these large clients. I mean, I'm not saying it can't be done. Obviously, it can be done, but I think the risk goes up a lot, as opposed to sort of first getting your product honed and building a base of customers and sort of then sort of using that as a launch pad to hire sort of like GTM teams there and build out a sales team. So yeah, so I think there's a lot of conventional sort of sayings that like Freshworks is kind of like, yeah, that's an old model and like is done and dusted and whatever, right? But actually the reality is like that has worked, right? And we have yet to produce another one that is different and has worked at that scale. And so until that happens, I think that is kind of like, it's not a bad idea to follow that.
So I have a question in the context though of this, early super cycle sort of stage, early stage of a platform shift. Do you think there's something about this approach that doesn't lend itself to those kinds of businesses where maybe you have to market make?
Absolutely. So I think the big challenge we have is that in Silicon Valley, like there is this notion of platform companies, right? And platform companies are very, very valuable, because everybody builds around them, right? So your app company or a platform company, obviously it's not black and white, there's probably shades of gray, but platform companies are very, very valuable. Microsoft was a platform company, so was Google, so was Facebook, so is OpenAI trying to be, right? And I think those are like the hardest ones. There are some strategies I think we can discuss later on, perhaps in the discussion, but very difficult, I think, to build those kind of companies. I think all of these things come together, but particularly I would point out the talent part of it is, I was thinking of how to explain this, and just bear with me, just imagine your talent as a pyramid, right? Which is very few people of, I guess, Nobel Prize winning sort of caliber, maybe a few more people at sort of like, inventors, people who file lots of patents, and then, I keep going down. And the base, you kind of have like your regular sort of workers, right? Maybe even unskilled labor, right? Now, I think to do different types of companies, not all of them need talent at the same level in the pyramid, right? So if you're gonna, let's say, let's talk about what Adani and Ambani and L&T do, right? And they build infrastructure, like hard infrastructure, right? Concrete and cement and stones and so on, right? What kind of talent do we need there? Yeah, we need a managerial class, but we need a large base of unskilled or semi-skilled labor, and we have that, right? So that's a good fit for us as a country. We are able to take those opportunities. We are able to build large petrochemical companies and cement companies or steel companies or whatever, right? Now you apply the same model to, let's say, you want to build an OpenAI, right? And you need pretty close to the top of the pyramid, if not the absolute pinnacle, but pretty close to the top of the pyramid. You need like a few hundred engineers, right? Now we as a country are not at that stage. It doesn't mean we don't have those engineers. We do have them, right? But do you have them at the scale, right, where you can build an OpenAI? And not, by the way, not just one OpenAI, because you have to compete with all these MNCs. So, all these MNCs are also going to be feeding into the same pool of fish, plus yourself, plus a few other startups, right? And do you have, your talent, is that top of the pyramid so big for you as a country that you can build those? And I think honestly the answer is no. The US has it, right? And maybe even Europe doesn't have it. And certainly, Latin America doesn't have it, right? Or like places in, nobody's building OpenAI in Thailand or Malaysia or Singapore, or last I checked, right? So I think that's a very simple lens to look at it, is that, where do you come in at from a talent perspective, and do you have the volume you need, right, to build your kind of company? And I think the lesson, I think, from every platform company I've seen is that you need lots and lots of people like that, right? Microsoft at its heyday and even today has like amazing people working for it. So did Oracle. Google, of course, was a talent powerhouse. It was famous for essentially having so much talent that everybody felt like they were wasting talent, right? There are thousands of engineers of the absolute top caliber, and the running joke in the valley was, hey, like the biggest waste of talent. I mean, of course, whether it's wasted or not is a moot question, but they had that talent, right, to tap into, right? Yeah. And that's, I think, the specific problem that we have with building, an OpenAI scale company, right? And there are many ways of solving it, right? I mean, you can't do it in India. Let's take that as a starting point, right? You can get started in India, because the day you start a company, you don't need 100 engineers, right? You need like, if you had like 5 amazing engineers, you would be, I would suggest, pretty well placed as a company, right? I think that, the DeepSeek team is pretty large, but I'm sure, that they had a much smaller team when they got started. They've been around for 2-3 years, right?
No, that's interesting. Maybe just one thing here is there one reason, or do you think it's just that all of these factors need to come together, which is people need to stay, capital needs to come in, incentives, people, there need to be companies.
I think these are all, we try to disentangle these things, but actually it is very hard. They are all related. Talent is required for success. Success is required to give confidence to investors that I can invest large amounts, right? Success also needs a large market. So if you look at the triumvirate of these things, talent, capital, and market, we have clearly come a long way from the last 10 years back. So I'll give you one very, very concrete example that I personally know of fairly well. These days, you will find a lot of software companies, for good or bad, they get started selling to Indian banks, for example, right? Surprisingly, Indian banks are actually a lot more open to buying software than Western banks. It's actually, I think, a little bit easier to sell to an ICICI than to a Wells Fargo. So some of these things have come together. Our market, our local market is bigger. Today, we have a lot of customers in India. We are selling to other SaaS startups, and that was simply not the case, 10 years back. Today, you can go, if you have a good product, that there's companies like Razorpay. They buy software. Actually, Razorpay was a huge customer of Qubole. So I think our ecosystem is strengthening. Our markets are getting bigger, that they can be the foundational markets for some of these companies. Our capital is getting more confident because they have seen examples of success, so they can invest. And our talent pool, as on naturally, as we develop, our talent pool gets better and better. Right? But I think the things that are difficult for us is that when we look at this sort of the snowball that needs to sort of keep rolling, right? With this maybe these three sort of like vertices or whatever, right? There are a few challenges. I would say the number one challenge we have is our talent. Talent is global, right? Capital is global is a positive for you because it will come looking for you. Talent is global is not a positive if you cannot retain it, right? So, I mean, to be brutally honest, a lot of folks, continue to want to move out, and I'm sure you guys have sort of experienced this yourselves. I had a long experience with this, and so whatever talent we have gets diluted. Now, is that's to some extent part of our sort of economic stage. The immigration is always high during earlier economic stages. Some of it is, we are shooting ourselves in the foot with the level of investment we are doing in the cities and the condition of the cities and a lot of the issues that sort of we are all more than familiar with. But the net result is, our talent gets diluted, right? GTM, I think it is possible. I mean, if somebody really sets their mind, they can go and do the US GTM, right? It's possible. It's not that it's not possible. And we've also discussed there are other ways of getting bootstrap. So that also, I think, is not, it's not such a big deal. It is possible. Look at DeepSeek. They don't have a US GTM, right? They have money, they have talent, and they built a world-class product, and the whole world came to them, right? And they have the local market. So I think on the market side, there's definitely one difference, and maybe we should have a complete China section, right? That the government in China, I mean, it's not just the government, but they kind of have this sort of whole like buy Chinese kind of thing. Like they have the firewall and like a lot of particularly digital products like are bought sort of locally rather than sort of like imported from outside. Like Google is banned, YouTube is banned, like this ton of almost everything is sort of all the majors are banned. So that creates a local market for them, right? So there's a Baidu because why does it exist? Why does China have a Baidu and we don't have a Baidu? Because we have Google and like they don't have Google, right? So so I think there are things we can do and we can go deeper into them. But I would particularly point out the fact that you have an open market and that you have open labor, and so therefore you can have the companies from the West who are dominant platform players come and take up your local market, and you have your best people work for them or even leave. I think makes it hard to imagine that you have an Indian sort of OpenAI. I mean, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Right? Isn't OpenAI Indian if it comes here and sort of hires 100 engineers? Right? Databricks has a big team here now, I think. I have a lot of friends working in Databricks. They have like, a few hundred engineers here now. So even Databricks is, Indian to some extent, right? So, sorry, there's a lot of confusion around these terms,
Yeah. No, makes a lot of sense. I think I agree with most of the things you said, but I'd love to sort of like dig in more into China and DeepSeek and so on and so forth, right? Because if you think about it, when I'm trying to unpack it, you spoke about the fact that, hey, it's a closed market. They're not allowing for competition to actually end up entering the market. But what are the other reasons you feel actually led to the formation of like DeepSeek and just...
Yeah. So let me tell you what I know. And I was actually, thinking of writing a follow-up to that article, but then, it's kind of sitting in the draft somewhere. But I did actually do a little bit of collation of some of the points around China. So a few points I would mention. First of all, I think in India there is lack of understanding of how good the Chinese sort of the human talent base is, because we have very little exposure, and there's all this sort of like toyish sort of ridicule that they like just copy and stuff. And I think that's just not true. And I'll tell you, my exposure to this. So obviously I worked at Facebook. I had a lot of Chinese colleagues, and they had Chinese colleagues back in China. And this was like 12 years back, maybe even longer. Sorry, even longer back, much longer, almost 15 years back. And they had Baidu, and engineers in my team, new engineers in Baidu. they were exceptional engineers. So they were making also contributions to open source to some extent. Or sometimes they didn't, they just did something, but we got to know what they did. And I could sense that, look, these were like really, really top class engineers. Right? So, and of course, my colleagues were top class. I mean, I think, if you look at some of the universities, particularly, my exposure mostly to Tsinghua University, they produce fantastic graduates. They're a huge college. Their graduates are everywhere in the Bay Area. Right? I think one of the things is that, sorry to be a little bit stereotypical here, but I think Indians are a very good managerial class. So our success in Valley, is very disproportionate to our technical base. So, if you look at Sundar Pichai and, Nadella and like George Kurian, or like, there are like, so many top CEOs. So we have done exceptionally well as a managerial class, much better than the Chinese. And that leads to the sort of a perception that, hey, we are kind of dominating the valley or very, very successful. But if you look at more at a ground level, at the engineering staff, at the people who actually build technology and do engineering, China is, very, very good, very good. And I don't know all the factors. I'm just sort of giving you the observation that their quality of human base in engineering and technology is very good. Now, to support some of these points, I mean, I would point out that today, if you go, I was just, for this draft that I was sitting in some drive somewhere, I looked up the top 20 Asian universities. 18 of them, or 17 or 18 of them from China, and the remaining 2 or 3 are from Singapore. Right? We are nowhere in the picture. Right? If you look at the world top, if you go a little bit broader, even at the world's top 20 or top 100 or whatever, of course, they don't dominate that list as much, but they have a lot of top. They have at least 3, 4 top 20 universities. We have none. We barely have some in top 200. ISC and IIT Bombay and IIT Delhi, perhaps, right? But those come like greater than 100 ranks, right? So one factor of this is that their university ecosystem is way, way, way better. So much better that we cannot even imagine. I'll give you another anecdotal example off the shelf. So just like you guys and everybody, I browse a lot of Twitter and I get a lot of my AI sort of information from Twitter. And I was, there's this guy who posts like a weekly summary of the top papers. And this just was like 2, 3 days back. And I have it bookmarked. I can share it with you. I was looking at going through the papers. I was like, man, every one of these papers is written by an all Chinese team. 100% Chinese. Like, forget about, like some Chinese or Asian folks, mixed with some American folks or whatever. 100% Chinese, right? So they are producing an astonishing amount of research and engineering in AI. And I think the world is waking up. I knew 15 years back that these guys were like really good, right? It's just that, they were not that prominent. They were maybe not publishing as much and whatever, right? They were just working in these large companies and sort of doing whatever they had to do. But now, there's this university ecosystem, lots of researchers. That iceberg has sort of surfaced. It's just showing the tip of the iceberg, right? Third thing I would point out. So we talked about the quality of the human base. We talked about the quality of the universities. If you look at emigration stats, it used to be that, both Chinese and Indian folks used to emigrate to the US a lot. I think back in our era, I think they were close, if not exactly the same. I think Indians tend to immigrate a little bit more, but it was pretty close, right? Now what is happening is that the Chinese are still coming to the US for studies, but they are going back. So if you look at the net immigration volume, and there are like lots of studies to back this up, the most of the immigrants in the US now are Indians, and the Chinese come study, they go back, right? And that's not just today, like of course the Chinese, the CCP had that as a strategy. They were also sponsoring students to come to the US, learn, and then go back from national security and economics perspective. But net result is they are not losing as much of their talent. So huge talent base, fantastic universities, not losing it.
Right? Sorry, why do they go back? Is it because that's the terms of their education?
So let's come to that part. Why are they going back? So I think there are a couple of things. One is a general sort of economics concept that immigration sort of first goes up and then goes down. Because, like when you're a poor country, people just want to emigrate because it doesn't matter how well the country is run and whatever. I mean, you just make more money outside. So at the end of the day, that washes out a lot of the lower order bits, and immigration always goes up in the beginning. And I think they went through that phase. So back, like if we're talking about 15, 20 years back, they were also emigrating a lot. And obviously the drivers were, hey, I can make more money in Silicon Valley than I can make in Beijing, right? Now, one broad thing is they have crossed that hump, right? So now their economy, their average GDP, and particularly in areas like Shenzhen, Beijing, and all the sort of the prosperous parts, is pretty good, right? And they don't have that urge that I need to emigrate to a Western country to enjoy a decent standard of living or make a lot of money, right? So that is, I think, macro. Will happen to us also. Having said that, I do think that, and it's hard to get your biases out of the way here. I'll tell you another small story, and I think you will relate to this. So I have a lot of Chinese colleagues in the US, as I mentioned, and I'm connected to them on Facebook. And just a couple of days back, one of the persons I long friends with, she used to work in my team. She's an avid marathoner, runs a lot in the Bay Area, and she said, I went back to China after 20 years. I've gone back to Beijing, and I took a run because that's what I do. And she said, this is the best city I've ever run in. And she gave a map, the Strava or whatever, right? And she ran 20 kilometers or whatever, right? And look, I think, can you talk about any Indian city and say that, look, that's the best city to run in? Like, if you come out alive without sort of like, black soot running down your nostrils after 20 kilometers of running in any Indian city, that'd be a surprise, right? Particularly the ones that you want to live in, right? So look, I think the reality is that one is the general economic curve and so on. But, I think our country, is hopeless when it comes to managing urban spaces and creating sort of environments where young people would want to live in, build families, and sort of, invest their whole lives. And obviously it's a huge factor. It's not just money, right? Because you can actually make pretty good money in India, right? I mean, you can completely counter argue me and say, hey, Joy, your arguments are bogus. You can just go on, Upwork and Fiverr and just do remote contracting. And I know a lot of people doing remote contracting. You can remote contract for OpenAI. If you're a great, deep learning researcher, they would happily do a contract with you sitting in India, and they probably pay you something similar to what they pay an American employee, right? So it's not that you cannot earn money here, right? But still people leave, right? So, and I think, we have to be honest, get beyond our nationalistic, and jingoistic sort of, discussions, and be honest that, like, yes, money is a big part of it, but there is things beyond money. People just move for a quality of life, right? And you guys have all sort of, I'm sure, witnessed that. I remember, 10, 15 years back, I went to London as part of sort of some business travel, and I was sitting in this, I think close to the Queen's, sort of the Regent's Park, right? Yeah, so close to all the palaces and stuff. This beautiful garden and this roses, and I was just like sitting. I went with my mom, and I just sitting down, and I was just thinking that that thought has never left my mind. That look, the most of the people around me here, they're not very rich. Right? UK is not a very rich country. A lot of them are might be a janitor or might be like an average worker, right? Just came for the weekend with his family to just sort of hang out and sort of have a good time, right? And it's a beautiful place, right? And so the reality is that in a well-managed country, even at a much lower level of income, you get to enjoy these things. The life of an average person is way better than the life of an average person in India, right? And at some point, these factors kick in.
So let me do this. I mean, just to bookend this conversation, I feel like there's another interesting conversation on back to the entrepreneur option side. What are the things that entrepreneurs can do? Or what are the things entrepreneurs can do? I just want to bookend this conversation asking you. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen a lot of conversations around the Indian government wanting to invest in AI, and then a lot of folks saying, I'm building my own project and so on. We've touched on different aspects and constraints and so on. But what would, I guess, the ask from the Indian government to facilitate something like this in a T+20 year framework for the next super cycle? Would you say the focus, if you had to wish anything on them or for them, would it just be to make India a more livable place for talent that says, I want a more holistic setup, and then maybe the other forces of just broader GDP growth and global capital?
I can certainly mention something. So I think one of the things that we have not touched upon is that a lot of people who are asking this question, why can't we have our own API, OpenAI? To be fair to them, I think they're asking this not from a commercial perspective, but from a national security perspective.
Yeah.
They're thinking that this is a key piece of technology and we need to have control. And that's very important because it's very clear that AI is going to be super duper important in the military space. And that you cannot outsource that, right? So we need to have our own competence. So I think I strongly support, part of the sentiment here that to the extent that national security is involved, you need to take a hard look at what you need in house and build the capabilities. And when you do that, you have to be cognizant that you have to be somewhat competitive in the labor market. You will need some like really good people to come and work for you to build your sort of all the vision stuff, so that you have autonomous bots in the military, sort of like the arena and fighting it out and all this stuff. You need some really top class people, and we need to build those capabilities, right? This is not really an ask for the government. I mean, honestly, like we have really struggled with this. I mean, everybody knows the issues we've had with sort of having our own fighter jets and so on and so forth. The model that has worked well in India is sort of like a public-private partnership. I think the best thing we have seen is like Nandan Nilekani and the way he did the Aadhaar and that whole India stack and so on. And that was done outside of the bureaucracy, right? I mean, if we asked like CDAC to do Aadhaar, like it will never happen, right? Or NIC to do Aadhaar. It happened because it happened in the private sector with somebody who worked with the government. So I think, the sooner we wake up and build those kind of structures where the government has business, it has money, it is spending like thousands of crores on national defense, right? It needs to create this structure where the private sector and some really good people, and there's no dearth of good people. We have discussed this. We have a lot of good people. They need to be sufficiently incentivized and motivated to come together. And one of the primary motivators is money. The government has tons of money. It needs to create those kind of structures so that, at least from a national security point of view, we are covered, right? If we think it's just going to happen magically, it's not. It's not going to happen commercially for all the reasons we have discussed. It's not going to happen in the bureaucracy because there's no way the bureaucracy or anybody hired by the bureaucracy in the bureaucracy can ever compete, by thousands of miles against like all these leading. And this is a race. I think there is a sense in India that we can run this race at our own pace. We can build like a 40-year-old fighter and call it the latest and the greatest, and because it's our own pace. But the world doesn't care; it has moved on. That's like 2 generations old, right? You're not competitive. Nobody gives a shit. Nobody's buying your fighter, right? Because it's completely irrelevant. And so I think the government really needs to wake up. And I think I feel like this. I mean, there are some signs that it understands. I think we need to replicate the Nilekani model and the Aadhaar model. So that is one part, right? The second is, what can government do for outside of national security, for the ecosystem, right? And I think, I read this piece. I will just reinforce something that someone else wrote that I think resonated with a lot of people. I forget the name of this person. He's CTO at Zerodha, very, very good guy. He writes pretty good articles. And, he wrote an article saying that, look, you guys are like all bullshitting. It's all about people. And I strongly believe in that. And I think that's been the whole thrust of the discussion here, is that the government of India just needs to figure out how to create an ecosystem where the best people live in India, work in India, incorporate in India, do business in India, right? And I don't think the government is serious about this. But let's take things that are not difficult, right? And I think Rohith must be very familiar with this. If you start a business in India and you want to do business globally, that means you need to employ workers globally. You need to contract out. The best people are global, right? You can't have like a company solely built out of Indian DNA, tap into the best talent in the world. And you look at how difficult it is to move money from Indian companies outside. Every single transaction is this FMR rules and threatening posture, treating people as criminals by default, and putting them under the threat of the gun if they do like forex transactions, right? Honestly, I cannot believe why somebody would incorporate in India. I strongly, like, if I want to build a global company, I will never ever incorporate in India. I might work from here, but I will never incorporate because there is no freedom of capital, right? So I think we are apologies to our finance minister and Modi ji and all this stuff. I know they are trying to do their best, but I think the bureaucracy and the political class are living in some prehistoric era where they think that just because we have a large economy, the best people will come and work and live and build companies here. No, they won't. They will go wherever it is the easiest to do business, right? So capital movement, your courts don't work. Nobody wants to fund or build companies where the contract system cannot be enforced, right? So those are, I think, so the urban mess I will leave out of the picture because it's a very federated problem. It's a very difficult problem. I realize it's a very difficult problem. But reforming your Foreign Exchange Management Act and making forex movement easy is not a difficult thing. It is something you just want to have to do. And at this level of the economy, at a $5 trillion wannabe sort of super economy or whatever they want to call it, why do you have these draconian laws? What are you afraid of, right? The one thing that can be done to some extent, I think we are never going to be a protectionist society. So I don't think we have any hope of, or should, build a Chinese kind of a firewall and so on. But I think it is worth thinking that to the extent that the government, uh, in particular, is investing in IT and sort of software and technology, can it skew the playing field a little bit in favor of local players? Again, we don't want a protectionist Raj and a crony Raj and so on. But I think there can be some consideration that for example, if you're buying some kind of and again, the notion of what is Indian is very complicated because capital is global, every company is global. But still, I think maybe you can say that, look, if I'm going to do some modernization project in some department of the government, and I'm looking at a technology provider, I can give some preference to those who have a lot of value added in India, right? Why not? It's a sort of I'll help the team. So it could not be that it's an Indian company because I don't think there is a notion of an Indian company. It is quite meaningless. But yes, you can say that look, if you have a substantial presence here, you are doing a large part of the value addition of your product from India. Maybe I can give you some handicap points so that you come off better in the tender, right? So I think that can be done. I think it will be a good step. I did feel, again, I don't think anybody wants a protectionist charge, but I did feel that I wish we had some of that support in Qubole. I think it would have been nice. Because we were doing a lot of things that could have helped. Yeah, large scale digital initiatives in India because everybody was doing big data and so on. Um, but I don't think there was any way where we could sort of interact with the government. We could sort of help it, sort of help them and help us. Both ways, right? We have competence, they have need, they have money, we need money, right? Um, so that was not possible. I don't think it's still possible. I'm really unsure of how much this kind of thinking is there and so on. I hope that some of the local AI companies like Saravam, I hope they're able to tap into this. I know the CEO is also from that ecosystem. I think he himself has worked inside the government. So hopefully some of this. But I think we cannot localize it to just one venture and one area. Right? I think there should be a little bit of thinking in the government that how do we skew a little bit in favor of the local players. Not too much, but a little bit, right? So, like for example, if you are, and why just AI? Like let's to look at machinery. Like surely the government buys a lot of machinery, right? And we seem to import a lot of it. Like I mean, see a lot of caterpillars and so on, right? And surely there are some Indian companies, who are also trying to make those things, right? Do we have a system where those companies can get a little bit of push from the government, right? At least to get them off the ground, because getting off the ground is really hard,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, so those are some things I can think of.
That makes sense. Yeah, and on that, it does seem like the US of late and China more generally have been putting their thumbs on this. Governments have been putting thumbs on the scale to help their own companies.
China is deep into this. I mean, I don't think they
China's
even
deep.
realize. They have shut out the internet. Obviously, their government is like deep into like sort of local, pushing their local players and so on. And I don't think I personally don't have any understanding of the CCP to understand, how much of this they are doing. But clearly, look at their defense industry. It's amazing, right? Every 100% sort of homegrown.
Yeah, there seems to be a trend towards de-globalization itself, especially after Trump came. It's happening everywhere in the UK, so on. So next few years are going to be interesting.